Okay, so welcome to this second lecture of the course. And this lecture is called An Intersectional Approach to War and Peace. And during this lecture, you will meet me. I'm Terese Anving, a senior lecturer in gender studies with a PhD in sociology at Lund University, Sweden. And you will also meet Andrei Vazyanau from European Humanities University in Vilnius. And this lecture consists of two parts. So I will start the lecture by talking more broadly about the concept of intersectionality. And then during the second part of the lecture, Andrei will talk to you about a more regional aspects of an intersectional analysis and what that can mean. So in this first part, as I said, I will talk about intersectionality as a concept, but also in relation to peace and war. So the reading for this lecture, as you might have seen on the website, is this quite short article about by Elena Bystravevska and Sarah Smith from the Center for Women, Peace and Security at London School of Economics. And it's quite a short piece, but it's really, I would say, a really good piece, a very introductional piece. And I will also, during the last part of the lecture, suggest some further readings for those of you who are interested. And as I said, I will focus on the concept of intersectionality. And for those of you who are well acquainted with gender studies, you are also most likely to be somewhat familiar with this concept. For those, I do urge you to read up on it in relation to war and peace. For the rest of you, I will, during the lecture, turn our gaze both towards the theoretical use of the concept as such, but also to how it has been used within peace and war studies. So I also want to say that I think it's really important that we already early in the course define the concept and what it means, because you will come back to this concept during the course several times. So during the last decades, intersectionality has become the concept almost within gender studies. Of course, not used by everyone, but it is a concept that is discussed by many, and if not used, then at least related to also by many. And the concept refers to how multiple factors of systems of power and oppression, such as gender, race, class, age, and sexuality, intersect in defining the societal structures and people's lived experiences. So in conflict-affected societies, the concept can help us to understand not only the kind of violence different people suffer, but also different interests, needs, agencies, and views to what constitutes inclusive and sustainable peace. So the concept of intersectionality has its theoretical roots within Black feminist studies, and the idea that gender, race, class, and sexuality and age intersect had been used before the concept as such was brought to the fore by scholars, especially from the global south. However, and they have long been arguing then that focusing only on gender was never enough. If doing so, or when doing so, it intended to focus only on white middle-class women's experiences. So Black feminists argued that there is a need for us also to turn our gaze towards how race and class intersect with gender. But as I said, the concept of intersectionality was then not used. The concept as such was launched by the legal race scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. So what Crenshaw did was that she showed in her classic text, that you will get later on during this lecture in the readings part, that women of color were unable to access protection for sex and race discrimination. So she had different cases, and one of the cases that she analyzed was called the Graffenried versus General Motors. And that case concerned 5 black women who sued General Motors, the American company General Motors, arguing that their principle of promotions were in their disadvantage. So they brought this case to the court, and during the court case, it became apparent that General Motors had not employed black women before 1964, which meant, and this was in the 70s, that this group of women, black women, were affected more than other groups of employees during the oil crisis in the 1970s. So the neutral principle that General Motors had of last in, first out, did not lead to a fair system, they argued, but instead became a prolongation of the segregation laws. So how was this then? Why was this? So when the judgment was announced, it was clear that the anti-discrimination laws were insufficient for this group of black women, as they either, the segregation laws then, prohibited segregation based on sex or race, not both of these together. So in the case of General Motors, black men had long been employed, as had white women. So thus it was impossible to show that the company discriminated a particular sex, women, as white women had been employed for a long time, or a particular race, African Americans, were not promoting the women that had sued them, because then black men had been employed for a long time. So starting out from this case, Crenshaw argued that inequality could not be understood from just looking at one angle, and one of these axes, gender or race, but had to be seen as multiple intersecting axes of social division. So she thus argued that the metaphor of intersection, as the picture on the slide here, was useful for understanding how relations of inequality affected each other. And she argued that any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which black women are subordinated. So in Crenshaw's, the literature then, and studies using the concept of intersectionality clearly filled a missing gap in the literature, which is very obvious when looking at the number of studies within various fields in which the concept has been used. So the concept has been used in sociology, in political science, criminology, but also in social epidemiology, health studies, medical studies, gender studies, of course. So it has gained, it's really spread and been used a lot. So intersectionality then can be used as a concept, but it has been used as a theory, as a method, and reading strategy for feminist analysis, as well as I said, concept analytical tool. So used in different ways, that is. So it has been argued that it is its lack of precision and its myriad missing pieces that have made it such a heuristic device, meaning that scholars tend to put different things into the concept and use it in different ways, but that this also means that it opens up for new questions and for us in thinking in new, unexplored ways. And in Crenshaw's own words, she says, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there is a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. Some people look at intersectionality as a grand theory of everything, but that's not my intention. If someone is trying to think about how to explain to the courts why they should not dismiss a case made by black women, just because the employer did hire blacks who were men and women who were white, well, that's what the tool was designed to do. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, it's not like you have to use this concept. So there are, however, a number of common themes for thinking through intersectionality as a concept. And that is that using intersectionality, however, means that you are interested in focusing on social inequality and how different axes intersect, but also how social inequality is reproduced in different ways. It also means that using an intersectional perspective means that you focus on power relations and intersecting systems of power that shape people's lives and identities. An intersectional approach also means that focusing on relationality and interconnections rather than making clear distinctions between entities and systems. It is not about adding power relations onto each other, like adding gender and then race and then class and then saying that this then means this will give these particular effects, but rather see how they interconnect in different social contexts. Context meaning that it's not going to be the same everywhere and in every different social context. Instead, you have to highlight the particular social context, looking at the specific outcomes of different positions in terms of gender, class, race, etc. But it also means that you try then to grasp the complexity of the world, and the tool of intersectionality is then used in order for trying to aim for social justice. So in their article, Stravevska and Smith argue that the concept is necessary for war and peace studies. They argue that the concept of intersectionality make possible different kinds of analyses that previously often had been overlooked. So introducing this concept made possible new kinds of analysis and new questions. And what they argue is that mainstream peace studies tend to approach post-war societies in a static and unidimensional manner, fixed in space, time, and identity. And this way of understanding the world and in trying to understand what peace or war is tends to fail to recognize differences within certain groups relating to, as I said, class, gender, age, but also geographical position, political views, and that the experiences of war, of course, also affect the understanding of what peace and justice is. That meaning that this will not be the same for everyone. So, intersectional critique towards peace studies has brought to the fore Frantz Fanon's theoretization of peace as peaceful violence, meaning that peace and violence intersect and coexist with one another. One cannot exist without the other. And by peaceful violence, Fanon refers to the fact that peace can be and also be understood as the regulation and normalization of violence if peace is not done in a way where social justice for different groups are brought into this discussion, rather than the non-existing violence. So the regulation and normalization of violence rather than non-existing violence. Then again, urges us to think about the need to look at different positioning and how peace will affect different groups of people in different ways, and the meaning of peace will have different outcomes. But starting out from the concept of intersectionality, they argue, one can instead make possible to acknowledge the plurality of experiences and systems of oppression, urging us to think further about who benefits and how. So Stravevska and Smith further argue that intersectionality is a necessary concept in understanding what peace is. It turns our gaze towards who gets to define it and whose voices and experiences risk being silenced within such a process. They write, the understanding of peace and violence therefore must engage in an analysis of the violence and conflict that exist within and are reproduced by power structures, be those economic, racial, or gendered. For example, women's complex roles, contributions, and experiences in war, often being portrayed as either victims or agents of change, or as symbols of a nation, are often overlooked, as some experiences tend to be acknowledged and generalized, while others are overseen, both during war and conflict and in its aftermath. Whose viewpoints do we start out from, and what are the consequences of this? We thus need to ask ourselves. And what is important to remember is that an intersectional analysis is not just an analysis of multiple experiences and oppression during, for example, war, how war then affects different groups of people in different ways, depending on positions just discussed. But it is also a tool to critically reflect upon how these structures are produced. And by doing so, also take the analysis one step further. So finally, what Stravevska and Smith argue is that in studying war and conflict, as well as conflict resolution and peace building, one needs to take these multiple experiences into account and include an analysis of how power operates within and between social division. A non-intersectional analysis of conflict and societies affected by war risk erase recognition of conditions of structural violence and, as a consequence, prevent peace. So here are some further readings. You will also be able to find the references at the website. And there you will also find the slides. So I will now hand over to Andrei, who will focus on a regional intersectional analysis. Okay, thank you very much.
Now I will try to provide a regionally specific commentary to the intersectional approach topic. It is possible to say that historically intersectional approach developed in American context around the formations of race, class, gender, and sexuality. But on a regional level, some additional categories may come to the fore and might be important for intersectionality. And these categories include nation, ethnicity, language, and citizenship. Nationalism and nations were traditionally discussed by men in male circles. They have been construed as part of public politics, and we know from feminist research that women have been expelled from the public into the domain of private. So nationalism was even conceptualized as competing masculinities by feminist researchers. Despite that, or in parallel, gender relations have contributed enormously into development of nation ideas or nationalist ideas, including also conflicts and wars related to nation and ethnicity. Traditionally, or for a long time, women's movements and nationalist movements did not see each other as good allies. More recently, we can observe in a political sphere that particular movements and parties from the right political spectrum try to include and to use rhetorics of women's rights. And Sarah Ferris describes this phenomena as homonationalism, and she refers to alignment between rhetorics of protection of women's rights and gender equality in order to justify different racist, xenophobic prejudices. And quite often it is used to justify anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim policies and ideas. Jasbir Puar describes a phenomena of homonationalism, which is alignment of LGBT movements and nationalist movements. She gives a more nuanced definition of homonationalism, also looking at economic dimension of this alignment, and she argues that only some LGBT people can potentially benefit from this alignment, and usually these are people who are economically successful and with high income, actively consuming, and otherwise building into neoliberal and capitalist order. Speaking of those parts of the world that are traditionally not perceived as part of the West, relations between women, LGBT, war, and nation can be really tricky. I will speak about a region that have many different names, and they are not mutually changeable. So Eastern Europe is not the same as Central Eastern Europe, and then Eastern Partnership is something else. And then there are Baltic states and Balkan states, which all have the specifics. However, there is something that unites most of these populations. In particular, they experienced occupation more than once, most of them. And there is a very particular commemoration culture in these societies, where women are associated with home and men are associated with heroism at front line. So heroes are mostly those men who struggled for recognition of independence or restoration of independence, or who resisted to imperialist aggression. Another part of experience of this region is that gender orders of ethnic populations were imposed or affected or oppressed by the gender order coming from empire. And when we talk about post-empire period, there is quite often antagonism between conservative nationalist groups, and sometimes they would even argue that gay people cannot belong to the nation, which Nelly Sargsyan has shown on Armenian example. And at the same time, there is quite often a move towards gender equality and women's rights as a part of making Europe. This region is eternally seen as a region in the making and in transition. In Ukrainian case, such orientalizing view was criticized in a case study done by Serdukova and colleagues. This study analyzes an episode from TV show Gaycation, and the episode was made in Kiev in 2015, and it construes Eastern Europe as essentially patriarchist, nationalist, and homophobic space, which has to be transformed into real West that would be non-homophobic and non-patriarchist. Kiev is very selectively represented in this episode, so only those parts that look exotic or unusual for a Western observer, or for tourists even, we can say, they are in the frame. Although in fact in Kiev there are pretty many places that just look as a random European Western place, they were not included into the visual imagery of this episode. More than that, we see that entire country is represented through the capital city. Mostly people who speak for activists in this episode, they are leaders of registered NGO initiatives. And we see no people from grassroots initiatives. We see no people from rural areas or just from peripheries of the country. And quite often those who speak, they are either living in immigration or ready to immigrate, and then people who are working in more precarious economic conditions, they remain without voice. The focus on struggle between presumably imported ideas of homophobia from Russia and LGBT rights from the West precludes the audience from looking into economic or geographic dimensions of inequality among activists. So presumably homogeneous group with the help of intersectional tools looks as quite diverse, and it has its internal inequalities as well and tensions. Lese Pagulic analyzes the statements of Kiev Pride, which is a mainstream of Ukrainian LGBT activism, and she analyzes how Kiev Pride followed the logic of normalizing gays, mostly men, as decent taxpayers, consumers, and people with good income, otherwise good citizens, who are opposed to people living on social security benefits, people without a place of residence or without a stable income. Thus we see that problems of economic inequality are hidden, as well as problems of poverty, racism, and migrantophobia. When Pagulic looks at the case of exhibition Patriot Citizens Lovers, organized in 2015 at Pinchuk Art Center in Kiev, she notices that most of the videos actually consist of explanations of how LGBT people are similar to the majority. Instead of articulating complexity of society, instead of articulating some vulnerabilities that we do not share, speakers tried to build themselves into a mainstream narrative. And in this context, intersectional feminist critique of nationalism or militarism or xenophobia or racism is interpreted to it can be interpreted as a threat to national security even. And of course, since 2022, this is even more so. We must stress here that situations of systemic adversities, such as full-scale invasion or mass repressions of humanitarian crisis, they produce positions and hierarchies that are quite different from peacetime. An iconic example here is how men with Ukrainian passport cannot leave their country during martial law that has been introduced because of Russian full-scale invasion. And at the same time, we see that minor people and elderly males or men with 3 children, as well as women, can cross the border in both directions and use some opportunities that men inside Ukraine do not have. If we look at LGBT community or LGBT people in Ukraine, in this context we see the renewed discussion about recognition of same-sex partnerships, and the initiators of this recognition, they do not even hide that they started to speak again about this issue because of LGBT serving in military and defending the country on the front line. There even from beginning was an idea to only provide this right to those LGBT people who are on the front line. But then it started to be discussed as opportunity for every LGBT person in Ukraine. But we also can see that in this situation, LGBT people in other positions rather than on front line are not seen as contributing enough to deserve a right for same-sex partnership. If we are talking about activism and resistance on occupied territories, contested territories, annexed territories, territories of mass repressions and offended sovereignty, then we bump into particular intersecting invisibilities and the inequalities within formerly homogeneous or relatively homogeneous groups. Those inequalities and differences might also increase. If we think about ethnic and linguistic minorities on territories affected by war, if we think about Belarusian speakers in Belarus where mass repressions are backed by Kremlin, or if we think about Ukrainian speakers on occupied and annexed territories, then these minorities within occupied populations experience particular difficulties, but they also have very few possibilities to speak out. Lena Garelsheva has recently done a survey and a research on grassroots activism in Belarus, showing that there are still hundreds of grassroots women activists inside the country, but they cannot register their organization, they cannot apply for grant support whatsoever, they cannot speak in media. It is even more true for occupied territories of Ukraine. And it is also, it has gender dimension, because if we speak, for instance, about resistance on Belarusian side, then Kalinowski Regiment and partisanry on Railway or Belaruski Rayun, which are all male initiatives. They are comparatively visible. They get some coverage in news, also because people die on the front line. But then women's activism in spheres of culture, education, language, economy inside the country is also devoid of their voices, in comparison to diaspora also, for example. We see that in this context, intersectional approach quite often leads us to seeing some inequalities and disparities where we previously were seeing some homogeneous field. But on the other side, intersectional approach can also be used for bridging between groups who had few contact or who did not know about each other before, but who share some particular set of categories that might help mutual understanding. And there are many media projects that illustrate this idea, and there are just two on this slide. This is an Interval magazine, Interval, and womenplatform.net. Both projects are international, done by women activists and researchers, and they are kind of exercises in post-colonial solidarity. And I just can recommend to read them. They are all in many languages. Here you see the list of literature that I had quoted in my part of the lecture. And on the next slide, you will see some recommended further readings from Terese. Thank you.